Hello, I am back and it's Tuesday and I am going to finish reading chapter 9 in King George V's book. This is a book that you can find this on thriftbook.com. And if you can see this, it is written by Kenneth Rose. And I stumbled across this website and I think it's quite an interesting website for used books. And as you can see, you can get a hardcover of King George V. Kenneth Rose is the author. And it's got customer reviews and, you got your choices as of now for a very good condition or a good condition. Mine did not come with the book jacket, but it came perfectly pristine in its writing, and it did not have any markings, any pencil markings, any kind of markings at all. It was very, very good. But I committed to reading this book on King George V, and we're going to talk about the political pressures that he was under while he was the king, because as I mentioned, he's not an absolute monarch. He had to rule through parliament. And in this chapter 9, there are different topics it discusses. And it discusses the labor government, the age of Baldwin, Indian summer, at death's door, and MacDonald carries on. And we are right now in Indian summer. Each of these sections takes a bit of time to read, and that's why I've been reading them in 30-minute, 40-minute increments, because it takes a bit of time to read, but I don't want to shortchange people as I'm reading it. And I am reading to you this book and drinking from my espresso cup. Never, never, never give up. And this is Winston Churchill's saying, and I bought this when I was touring somewhere. Never, never, never give up. So just me saying, when I start a book, I like to finish it. If I'm going to start recording it, I like to finish what I started. So get a little comfortable in reading. And so as we begin, we're on a new section called Indian Summer. It was no state secret that the king disliked traveling abroad. From the end of the war until his death 17 years later, he spent scarcely more than 18 weeks overseas, 5 of them on an enforced Mediterranean cruise after a bout of bronchitis. The rest on reluctant official visits to France, Belgium, and Italy. Nor did the Queen ever undertake a foreign tour alone, even during the 17 years of her widowhood. So I'm going to get comfortable with them reading. But what I'd like to do is do a sound check to make sure, because it takes a long time to read through these. And before I even get started, because I did read one chapter and it took so long to read it. Was touring somewhere. Never, never, never give up. Okay, and it ended up the sound quality was not that good, and I had to reread it. But the sound quality sounds good. So I will finish reading. Dear good boys, but very exclusively English, Queen Victoria wrote of her grandsons, and that is a great misfortune. The naval cadet who was first seeing Spain wrote that one Englishman will do more in one day than 10 natives. He became the father who complained that one of his own sons had damaged a knee while playing French cricket, whatever that is. I should think a very silly game. The French Duke, who did not turn up for a tiger shoot, specifically arranged by the Viceroy of India, evoked the scornful comment, "These foreigners have not much an idea of sport." And Mensdorf, asked by the Prince of Wales in 1929 if he would suggest a visit to Austria and Hungary, recorded his conversation with the king. "It would be very nice if the prince would come sometime to Vienna. He has so much to visit in the empire, but it would be nice to see him in Vienna. Perhaps he might find a moment to come, as he might have never been here." Yes, he might. Mensdorf knew that it would be useless to pursue the subject further. No linguist himself, the king found both foreign languages and the misuse of his own never-failing source of human behavior. Distant sounds of Latin loquacity, Teutonic thunder, and Belgian bleating was how the Prime Minister's private secretary described an international conference. Knowing that he would find an appreciative audience at Buckingham Palace, the king, who loved to hear his favorite stories, repeated and would again and again as Lord Louis Mountbatten is to describe the visit of his sister. The crowned princess, later Queen Louise of Sweden, to Uppsala Cathedral. The archbishop, determined to show off his knowledge of English, approached a chest of drawers in the sacristy with the startling announcement, "I will now open these trousers and reveal some even more precious treasures to your royal highness." The common language between the old world and the new did nothing to dispel the king's insularity. "The nearest I ever got to the United States," he would say, was when I walked half across Niagara, took off my hat, and then walked back again." He gave no hint that he would have cared to continue any further. Like so many of his generation, he saw the citizens of America through the distorting lens of caricature. Brash, boastful, and mercenary. Even a compliment could thus be unintentionally offensive, as when Haig wrote of General Pershing, "I was much struck with his quiet, gentlemanly bearing, so unusual for an American, when the king noted that a newly arrived ambassador, Robert Worth Bingham, was more British than British. The king could never come to terms with the exaggeration and intrusiveness of the transatlantic press." His first disagreeable experience of his was in 1890 when an Irish-American journalist published a totally untrue report of his stay in Montreal. He was alleged to have taken part in a street brawl, to have been arrested and hauled through the streets at the bottom of the police patrol wagon. This fabrication, reprinted throughout the world, brought alarmed telegrams of inquiry from both Queen Victoria and the future Edward VII. After the war, the king was outraged by what he called an effrontery of American newspaper comment on his son's visit to New York. On one headline, "The prince gets in with the milkman," the king observed, "Fancy their saying that about you." And in 1934, there emerged from a committee of the United States Senate an absurd but wounding lie that the king had been speculating in the sale of munitions. He was delighted, however, by his anti-prohibition doggerel with his son he had picked up in a Canadian border town. 4 and 20 Yankees, feeling very dry, went across the border to get a drink of rye. When the rye was opened, the Yanks began to sing, "God bless America, but God save the King." When required to entertain individual Americans, the king readily put aside his prejudices. Mr. Franklin Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, he was a charming man. He came to see me, and he wrote in 1918, and he told me everything his navy was doing to help in the war, which is most satisfactory. In 1927, he received Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly the Atlantic single-handed and nonstop. "Now tell me," he began, echoing the thought that must have crossed the minds of so many of his subjects. "There is one thing I long to know. How did you manage?" The Queen, too, and for all her shyness, she could enchant American visitors. "Perhaps we should still be one country," she used to say, "if my great-grandfather had not been so obstinate." The king believed the visits between the monarchs were expensive. They were irksome and futile. After 1923, he never again set foot officially on foreign soil, however hard his ministers pressed him. I failed to get His Majesty to smile at all upon the idea of a state visit to Madrid. Stamfordham told Austen Chamberlain in 1926, "The King's view is that state visits have ceased to be any of political importance," but he remained a considerate and generous host. The young Crown Prince of Japan never forgot his reception at the palace in 1921. An elaborate program of entertainment. It included visits to Eton, Oxford, Cambridge, Sandhurst, and Chequers, dinner with the Curzons at Carlton House Terrace and Sybil at Daly's Theatre, golf at Addington, and a sitting to Augustus John. Half a century later, by now the Emperor Hirohito, he told the present writer with unconscious irony, "King George treated me exactly like one of his own sons." Another survivor from the reign of George V, who likes to recall the king's kindly tact, and is Count Dino Grandi, one arriving at Buckingham Palace in July 1932 to present his credentials as the Italian ambassador. He found that he had left the vital document at his embassy in Grosvenor Square. As he was being shown into the king's presence, he just had time to explain the disaster to an official, who asked him to wait a moment and disappeared into the audience chamber. The official emerging smile to tell Grandi that His Majesty wished to apologize for delaying the audience for a few minutes. Meanwhile, the ambassador's secretary had flown back to the embassy. They retrieved the credentials and returned to the palace. Only then did the king send word that he was ready to receive Grandi. The ambassador made a good story of it. No doubt the king made a better. "One of the things that comforted me when I gave up office," Baldwin said at the end of his life, "was that I should not have to meet French statesmen anymore." In this distaste for international affairs, there is a superficial resemblance between the prime minister and his sovereign. Yet any such comparison would be misleading. When Baldwin's colleagues began to discuss foreign policy in cabinet, he would ostentatiously close his eyes. "Wake me up," he said, "when you have finished with that." As Lord Halifax once observed, Baldwin was like an old fox that meets a smell he doesn't understand and goes miles around to avoid it. The king, by contrast, never shirked the duty of keeping himself well informed. In 1923, he tried to add his burden by asking no important dispatch should ever leave the Foreign Office without first being submitted to him. But the growing complexity of business and the speed of communication made such Victorian customs impracticable, and he received an evasive answer. "I have read your memorandum," the king once said to Vansittart. Not all of it, of course. It was, that verbose official noted, an encouragement to brevity, but also perhaps a reminder that the king did not care for an ornate or tortuous style that hid as much as it revealed. He liked gossip, however, and the Foreign Office would spice its solid fare with nuggets of human frailty extracted from the Secretary of State's correspondence. A brother sovereign who ill treated his wife, an unfaithful consort, an Oriental ruler addicted to unnatural vice. Horrible fellow was the king's usual annotation. Few ambassadors or other officials, when the king received an audience, failed to be impressed by the depth of his knowledge. Sir Michael Miles Lampson, later Lord Killern, who for 7 years represented his country in Peking, wrote in his diary that the king knew far more of China than did any of his ministers, including the foreign secretary. Staying at Sandringham while on leave for his next post, Cairo, he noted their talk about Egypt. As usual, H.M. knew all about it. Truly a wonderful man, and full of common sense and directness. Even the omniscient Hankey, reporting on his tour of the Commonwealth, wrote, "There was hardly a scrap of information, whether of material or political kind, with which the king did not seem to be familiar, but he left no lasting mark on events. He was consulted, he was encouraged, he warned. Policy, however, remained wholly in the hands of his ministers and their officials. It has sometimes been claimed, notably in a work about Prince and Princess Louis of Battenberg, authorized and inspired by their son, Lord Mountbatten, that there was a single exception to this. In 1922, when Prince Andrew of Greece, the father of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was imprisoned by a Greek revolutionary government and charged with treason. The dispute passage begins with an error and embraces several more. The king was only too aware of the weak manner in which he had allowed Lloyd George to overrule his wish to help the Russian imperial family to leave Russia. He was determined not to have what he regarded as the blood of another cousin on his hands. For the first and last time in his reign, he exercised the royal prerogative. The king telephoned the Admiralty and said that he wanted the Royal Navy to save his cousin, Prince Andrew of Greece, emphasizing that they must act at once to release him from prison. The power of royalty, the dispatch of a gunboat, could still influence events in foreign lands in 1922. The Admiralty and Lord Curzon at the Foreign Office, they acted swiftly. Commander Gerald Talbot, R.N., who had once been a naval attaché in Athens and knew more of the tortuous channels of the Greek politics than most Greek politicians, was sent out from Switzerland, where he was serving, to begin negotiations with the Greek revolutionary leader, General Pangalis. The 6-inch gunner cruiser HMS Calypso was sent to the Piraeus. The papers, now preserved in the public records, tell a different story. They reveal that the king did not initiate the operation or even express encouragement except through the constitutional channel of the Foreign Office. That the responsibility for the secret mission undertaken by Talbot, who was no longer a serving officer, lay with the certain Foreign Office officials, including, as it happened, Harold Nicholson. that the Greek revolutionaries allowed Prince Andrew to be smuggled out of prison only on the condition that they did not appear to be submitting to British naval pressure, and that the HMS Calypso, far from steaming into Falarin Bay, was cleared for action and was used only to transport the prince to safety once negotiations had been completed. The king did, however, show his appreciation of Talbot's courage and diplomatic skill by appointing him a Knight of Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. When the present writer drew Lord Mountbatten's attention to the official record of Prince Andrew's rescue, he generally admitted that he had been misled by his rather defective memory of events half a century earlier, and that the king's role had been both passive and correct. George V, by the grace of God, King of Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the sea, defender of the faith, Emperor of India, each of those resounding styles and titles touched a chord in the king's heart. Yet only once during his reign did he set foot in India, and never in Australia, or New Zealand, Canada, or South Africa. When implored to tour his dominions, he would reply that he won, and that the pressure of home business denied him long absences from London. Instead, he divided the role among his sons, whose youth and vigor were more attuned to those bouncing democracies. His own view of a dependent empire had scarcely changed since he sailed the world in a wooden man-o'-war. In 1928, the Colonel Secretary compared him to George III. The king, more talkative, not to say noisy than usual, Amory wrote after lunching at the palace. His main theme is, of course, a dislike of all the new developments in constitutional relations. 3 years later, when the state of Westminster recognized the legislative autonomy of the Dominions, Wigram called it a pedantic document drawn up by lawyers to satisfy the amour propre mainly of South Africa and the Irish Free State. That undoubtedly echoed his master's voice and marked a cooling of the king's enthusiasm for his dominions. For India, however, he retained a paternal pride that transcended each successive advance of the subcontinent towards self-government. He was the father of his Indian people, all 400 million of them. The Prince of Berar once asked Somerset Maugham, "Do you know the difference between the Yacht Club in Bombay and the Bengal Club in Calcutta? In one, they don't allow either dogs or Indians. In the other, they don't mind dogs." Since first visiting India as Prince of Wales, the king had deplored the mindless color bar which increasingly polarized European and Indian society. He gladly gave his patronage to the Wellington Club, named after the governor of Bombay, who founded it and opened it to all races. Even in London, he recognized the princely rank of men such as the Maharaja of Bikaner, placing him on the Queen's right at a palace luncheon in preference to a whole host of British grandees. And the king indignantly observed on that occasion, Bikaner and Sinha, the first Indians to be appointed to the Viceroy's Council, had made honorary members of all the best clubs in London, and yet neither would be admitted to a white man's club in India. He reversed the decision of a court official who took it on himself to declare that Indians receive honorary knighthoods were not entitled to the prefix Sir. Okay, that sounds very ethnically open-minded of the king, I believe. Neither members of his family nor the official world were immune to racial prejudice. His black sheep of a brother-in-law, Prince Francis of Teck, had only a few years earlier excused himself from dining in the country with the Grand Duke Michael of Russia on learning that his hostess would be taken into dinner by an Indian prince. "It isn't possible. I won't have it," he explained. "Besides, it will make the Rajah uncomfortable." Lady Diana Cooper had no such scruples in sitting next to the Aga Khan at the Ritz in 1919. But her presence affronted the Lord Great Chamberlain. "The sight of natives entertaining smart society women," he wrote, "is not pleasant." In 1927, when the Lord Lee of Farnham gave a garden party for 500 guests, his wife noted in her diary, "One thing Arthur was firm about was that he would not have any Indians asked." It was the same that Lord Lee, who had presided over the Royal Commission on the Indian Civil Service, shamelessly pestered the government until he received a GCSI, the most senior of all Indian knighthoods. The king, by contrast, was always alert to protecting both the dignity and the interests of his princely Indian subjects. He resented the refusal of successive British governments to allow artillery to the troops of the Indian native states, writing in 1923, "The king cannot help but feel that we do not sufficiently trust the ruling princes, whose existence and security is so closely bound up with that of the British Empire, both in time of war and international troubles, when they have never failed to come forward with offers of personal service, their troops and money." It was less a matter of armament than of prestige, but the cabinets neither of Baldwin nor MacDonald would go further than to authorize machine guns. If the king did have a fault in his concern for the Indian princes, it was not that he paid them too little regard, but too much, and sometimes that of excessively paternal kind, which his own sons had long endured. Those rulers were, after all, illustrious men in their own states. One was even descended from the sun. The king emperor was not at all gratified to receive a telegram from the Rajah of Pudukkottai announcing his marriage to a New South Wales Miss Molly Fink, an Australian girl. He was again put out to hear that another ruler, one of his pages at the Durbar of 1911, had subsequently become addicted to drink and low female company. He thought it was particularly deplorable. He found it in an old boy of Wellington College, Bikaner, appointed to the Imperial War Cabinet in London, was told that the king spotted him in a bowler hat and a suit of dittos, and in the future he was to wear the puggaree. The Aga Khan was taken aside on state occasion in order to see the Maharaj of Rajpapilia, who had omitted to give his trainer the customary present of winning the 1934 Derby with Windsor Lad, and it made good his lapse. Even the Aga Khan, the king thought, would do more good if he remained in India and kept in touch with his people instead of enjoying himself in Europe. Although by constitutional practice the appointment of Viceroy of India lay in the British government. The King Emperor had no hesitation in pressing his own candidates. He believed that neither previous knowledge of India nor political experience were essential qualifications for a viceroy. Above all things, he should be a great English gentleman, a man of character, of personality, a man of the world, of determination, fearless, independent, who would never let down the British Raj. On Chelmsford's retirement in 1921, the field included Churchill, Lytton, the Undersecretary for India, Wellington, successfully Governor of Bombay and Madras, and Reading, the Lord Chief Justice. The king would have chosen Wellington, but it was another 10 years before he reached Delhi. The appointment went to Reading, whose supposed political sagacity, sharp forensic mind, and liberal sympathies were considered protection enough against the wiles of Indian nationalism. The king did have his way when Reading came home in 1926. He first proposed Field Marshal Haig, but Baldwin preferred a civilian. It was then that the king suggested Edward Wood, the Minister of Agriculture, a fox-hunting Yorkshire squire whose compassionate Christianity concealed a steely regard for law and order. Wood's name found much favor with the cabinet. He went out to India as Lord Irwin, succeeding his father's title of Viscount Halifax. In the autumn of 1930, the search for a successor to Irwin provoked a rare and extraordinary clash between the Prime Minister and the King's private secretary. MacDonald, who had taken office for the second time after Labour's victory in the general election of 1929, decided that the new viceroy should be Lord Gorrell. It was a perplexing choice. Gorrell, the son of an ennobled lawyer, wrote contemplative poetry and detective fiction. He was an authority on army education and had served briefly as the Undersecretary for Air in Lloyd George's coalition. But it was at the age of 46 he revealed no aptitude for a proconsular role. Gorrell might nevertheless have gone to India had not MacDonald's intention come to the king's ear before he could express an opinion on it. Through Gorrell's publisher, the news reached Lady Brassey, who assumed that the appointment had been confirmed, mentioned it in a letter to a member of the royal household. The courtier, in turn, told Stamfordham, who, ever protective of the king's constitutional rights, complained to MacDonald that the sovereign's prerogative of consultation seems to have been ignored. The Prime Minister wrote in his diary, "Saw Stamfordham at the palace reception in the afternoon and had a very straight, perhaps even angry talk. Made it clear to him that whilst I was PM, I should not tolerate a procedure which would entitle him to show the king officially and communicate officially with me regarding personal letters of public affairs passing between the court entourage and their friends." MacDonald was mollified by a graceful letter of apology from Stamfordham, but the episode did make the Prime Minister pause before formally submitting Gorrell's name for India. At his next audience, the king politely confessed that he did not know Gorrell, and he wondered whether there were other candidates to be considered. Baldwin, with less finesse, warned that the Conservative would never accept him. Irwin wrote from Delhi that the rumored appointment had filled Indian opinion with anxiety. Such concerted expression of dismay put paid to Gorrell's hopes, who then was to take this place. There is evidence that the Prime Minister had in mind an even less conventional statesman. This undated card from MacDonald was years later found among the papers of J. H. Thomas. Absolutely secret to yourself, may I consider your name in connection with the Viceroyalty. Hope you will say yes. Details can be arranged. The appointment of the former railway might not have been unwelcomed either to the king, who trusted his judgment, or to the opposition. A year earlier, Beatrice Webb had written of him with arid contempt. In spite of his bad language, his coarse wit, and his more than doubtful city transactions, no word of scandal or disparagement appears in the capitalist press. To the suburban conservative, Jimmy seems that the one redeeming personality in the Labor government. Certainly, he would have made things hum in Delhi. On being asked by the Prince of Wales about a recent visit to West Africa, during which his children laid low by dysentery and malaria, Thomas had replied, "God, it's a bugger of a country." As Queen Mary said of him, "He is such a straightforward man." MacDonald, with his patrician instincts, could not quite see Thomas in a viceregal role. Instead, he nominated Lord Wellington, a former Liberal MP who had not only governed 2 Indian provinces, but had earlier captained the cricket 11s of both Eton and Cambridge. Of course, I agreed, the king wrote in his diary. I had proposed him to Lloyd George 9 years ago when he set Reading. Stanfordham, too, was delighted, writing to Baldwin. The appointment of Wellington averts what would have been not a blunder, but a disaster, especially at this momentous time in the history of India. Just how momentous emerges from the correspondence between the King Emperor and his viceroys. Over the years, those fortnightly letters reflect India's progress from paternalism to partnership. From a benevolent autocracy to a hesitant sharing of power, from dominion status to independence, so to memberships of the Commonwealth, that ingenious and civilized device by which Britain has exorcised the ghost of no longer fashionable empire. Only in retrospect does India advance to self-government seem inevitable. At no moment in a viceroy's life was any political solution safe from racial and religious strife. And magnanimous gesture from a questioning of a motive, each successive viceroy found himself trapped in a weary cycle of resentment and rebellion, of repression and reprieve. The king made himself as well informed as any man could across the distance of 5,000 miles. Either in his own hand or through his private secretaries, he would punctiliously reply to the letters and telegrams from Delhi. And the viceroys, for their part, knowing how laborious the king sometimes found his tasks, sugared their solid fare with sporting gossip. The pursuit of birds and beasts under the British Raj was not so much a recreation as a heretic cult, and no viceroy could be wholly effective who neglected its skills. Even as a boy, Irwin was overcome the handicap of an atrophied left arm and taught himself to handle both rifle and shotgun. He delighted in telling the king of a line of guns at Patilia 1.5 miles long, with 500 infantrymen and 150 cavalry acting as beaters. His princely host directing the shoot with the howdahs of 20 elephants. Of the bags of sand grouse at Bekaneer so huge that he was glad to have taken the king's advice and padded the butt of his guns with India rubber and leather. Or of breakfasting with the Maharaj of Benares, who threw a rupee high into the air then hit it with a rifle shot, a trick he had performed before the king years earlier. Poor Redding, who until he went out to India had wielded nothing more than a lethal golf club or an affidavit to record his exploits on a note of apology. At Bikaner, he told the king he had fired 1,700 cartridges but added only 336 birds to a total bag of 6,988. Under the tutelage of the Maharaj Scindia of Gwalior, however, the viceroy was fortunate enough to shoot a tiger of almost record length. Thus, the king vicariously relived those idyllic days which followed the Durbar ceremony of 1911. The viceroys are illuminated in their letters with pen sketches of those Indian nationalists who presaged the end of the British rule. In 1924, Redding wrote that Pandit Nehru, educated at Harrow and Trinity College and Cambridge, now wore kedar, a homespun cloth, but of extremely superior fine wovenly kind. The account continues. It is said that the old days, before he joined Gandhi when he lived in Allahabad as a celebrated and popular barrister, he not only kept open house and welcomed Europeans, but he was regarded, sir, as a complete dandy, in more European suits and clothes and hats than I've ever had myself possessed. As your majesty is aware, all this is now changed, and he's become a leader of the anti-government agitation. The story goes, as is, alas, so often the case, that the change dates from a social slight by British officers. And here in 1931 is Irwin on Gandhi. I think most people meeting him would be conscientious, as I was conscientious, of a very powerful personality, and this independent of physical endowment, which indeed is unfavorable. He's small, he's wizened, he's rather emaciated, he has no front teeth. It is a personality very poorly adorned with this world's trimmings. And yet you cannot help feeling the force of character behind the sharp little eyes and immensely active and acutely working mind. The king regarded Indian nationalism as he did industrial unrest at home. He wanted a contented people and was prepared to accept a measured advance toward self-government. Okay, that's quite interesting. See, he was prepared to accept a version of independence. But he deprecated any challenge to law, any order by the followers of Gandhi, an obstruction to the considered proposals of Whitehall and Delhi by a fractious assembly of princes. When Gandhi came to London in 1931 from the Round Table Conference of India, the king was reluctant to see him. What, he explained? Have this rebel fakir in the palace after he's been behind all these attacks on my loyal officers? But of course he relented, and although from time to time the king looked resentfully at Gandhi's bare knees, the two men found much to discuss. As Gandhi was taking his leave, the king uttered a stern warning. Remember, Mr. Gandhi, I won't have any attacks on my empire. Sir Samuel Hoare, the Secretary of State for India, later he recorded, Gandhi gave a grave and deferential reply. I must not be drawn into political argument in your Majesty's palace after receiving your Majesty's hospitality. and they parted on friendly terms. That account was published by Hoare more than 20 years after Gandhi's audience with the king. But Wyndham sent this more robust version to the new Viceroy, Wellington, only a week or two after the encounter. His Majesty, as his own custom, was very nice. He was nice to Mr. Gandhi, but ended up impressing on him that this country would not stand a campaign of terrorism and having their friends shot down in India. His Majesty warned Gandhi that he was to put a stop to this, and Gandhi spluttered some excuse to His Majesty and said he held him responsible. The king, with the same severity when the Indian princes demonstrated their own brand of civil disobedience on hearing that they had apparently rejected the federation proposed. Among other constitutional advances by the Government of India bill, he told Hoare, "I won't see them when they come to London. Why should they come to London at all and spend a lot of money? Tell them to stay in their states and look after their own subjects." Throughout even the worst of those political convulsions, the King Emperor never doubted the permanence of his Indian empire. The moment of his self-confidence stands on a ridge of a few miles from the old city of Delhi, the Viceroy's house, at once the Versailles and Valhalla of the British Raj. Okay, I am going to see if I can pull up the Viceroy's house was pretty interesting. Okay, I'm going to X out of this. I am going to see if I can. You know, this is actually a very good movie to watch. I thought it was very interesting movie, but it does display the Viceroy's house and what it looks like, which that's what the Viceroy's house looks like right here. If you can see it. So, very beautiful building. This movie was pretty interesting. Because whenever you're watching a movie, historical fiction, I would encourage you to, take it for what it is. But sometimes movies help you understand, like, an era. I like this movie. It was very interesting. So, but that's the Viceroy's house. So, we're just about done. Okay. Sloping gently upward, Robert Byron wrote soon after its completion in 1930, runs a gravel way of such infinite perspective as to suggest the intervention of a diminishing glass, at whose end reared above the green tops of glitter the seat of government, the seventh Delhi, foursquare upon an eminence, the dome, the tower, the dome, the tower, red, pink, cream, and white, washed gold and flashing in the morning sun. See that? Look at that. From the moment the king proclaimed the new capital of India at the Durbar in 1911, he followed the construction of the New Delhi with intense interest. His first instruction to the architect, Edwin Lutyens, was negative but aesthetically sound. I want, he said, referring to Queen Victoria's memorial outside of Buckingham Palace, no angel of victory, and for the next 20 years he was the most exacting of patrons. In 1916, when the government thought it was right to impose a measure of wartime economy on the plans, the architect wrote of an audience with the king. The accommodation of thickness of walls, the number of bathrooms were criticized. There was no sitting room for the wife of the viceroy attached to their bedroom suite. His Majesty was very emphatic on the importance of using monoliths for the columns throughout the palace. As to cost, it did not matter how long the palace took to build so long as it was, when built, worthy of India and its purpose, and that if money was not forthcoming now, parts might for the time being be omitted and facades left unfinished. The king was nevertheless impressed by Reading's warning that more palatial the viceroy's residence, the greater the expenditure, particularly on servants, and that it would be lamentable if this confined the viceroyalty to rich men. As it neared completion in 1928, Irwin's reference in a letter to Viceroyal Lodge drew a sharp inquiry from the king. Irwin apologized for the diminutive description, explaining that it was the name of his temporary perch. But he went on to argue that there was a case for calling even the new residence the Viceroyal Lodge. If the Viceroy's palace was designated a mere lodge, India could not fail to wonder what sort of house the King Emperor himself occupied. When that suggestion found no favor, Irwin tried again with the Viceroy's house. This time the king agreed, although amending it to the Viceroy's house. Kipling, who was staying at Balmoral, pleaded for the word palace. He was told that there was only one palace, that of the King Emperor. For all that, the Viceroy's house, New Delhi, is indeed a palace, and Edwin Lutyens, the last architect to receive so grandiose a commission, on the classical proportions of Europe, he imposed those traditional Indian elements that make an ally of the fierce and effacing sun, deep shadows of contrasting colors and colonnades. Then he crowned the whole with the ponderous dome, a symbol of power, yet a distraction from the daring simplicity of facade and cornice. Luton never forgave his fellow architect, Herbert Baker, who had been entrusted with the Secretariat buildings, for having insisted that they should share the same ridge as the Viceroy's house, and so deny it an unchallenged eminence. "I have met my Bakerloo," he declared. That defeat, however, was swallowed up in a greater. According to legend, every new city built at Delhi foretold the end of a dynasty. 20 years later, after Irwin became the first to occupy the Viceroy's house, Mountbatten became the last. Yeah, see, that is Mountbatten, his portrayal of Mountbatten. Neither George V nor his ministers, not even the most radical of them, envisioned so swift an end to the British Raj. But one old friend of his may have done, and that is George Clemenceau, the wartime leader of the French people, who came out to India in 1920. He gazed on the half-built walls of New Delhi and explained, "What a splendid ruin it will make." And that is the end of the Indian summer topic, and very good section. So just to show you what the Viceroy's house looks like. See, It's a very beautiful building. Very beautiful building. And this movie is very good. So if you ever want to watch it, I saw it on Amazon and I thought it was a pretty good movie about how Mountbatten was trying to, he was the last viceroy who was trying to help with the Indian partition. You know, a lot of elements go into that, but that's a good a rough exclamation, a basic exclamation of the Indian partition at that time. So again, I would check your history against any historical fictional film, but it's I thought it was a good film. It depicted some of the issues occurring in India at the time, but also it showed a beautiful display of the building and what happened during the Indian partition. Very interesting because after World War II, that is when Mountbatten went in to be the last viceroy, and after World War II, Britain, it became less powerful after the Second World War, and it lost its empire. It lost Ireland and it lost India as they both went on to become independent nations from Britain. So, very fascinating. But I am going to pick up and I am committed to reading the rest of this chapter. The next chapter is in Political Pressures, is entitled At Death's Door. So I'll read that in a separate segment, and I appreciate your time for listening, for anybody interested in listening. But I want to show you where you can buy this book. So if you're interested in buying the book, because it's not a very expensive book, and it's a very good book to have for your royal history library. And reading about King George is very key to understanding some things that transpired during World War II. So I think it's very interesting if people go back and read about the time. It includes everything that King George had to endure, well, manage as a constitutional monarch for Ireland and India. So he really did care about the people and the welfare of the people. So I think he was a good king. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode of At Death's Door. You have a nice day.